So good day, everyone, and thank you so much for deciding to join this session of Networking Unlocked for the Azure Data Services. I was thinking today that this is like the perfect setting for this because most people do not actually want to hear about networking for more than 10 minutes, or that's at least most of the people I've talked to. I myself actually enjoy networking a lot, but I know most people do not care about it more than for listening to it in 10 minutes. So I am Heini Ilmarinen, and I work as a DevOps consultant for a company called Polar Squad here in Finland. So I, for example, tackle these issues of how do we connect to our data services securely and also how we automate them. Today, we're not going to go into the automation part. We're just going to look at the different options that you have for really setting up your data services in a secure manner. And that is all we're kind of have time to cover in 10 minutes. I am a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and also a Microsoft Certified Trainer. And my favorite topic is architecture, which networking fits into very much. And my background is in mathematics. And as Ben was referring to my slides, you might see a few doodles here in the slides as well. So if we think about Azure Data Services, by default, when you create any kind of data service in Azure, you get a public endpoint. And depending on the data service that you are setting up, it will either be open to all the world from anywhere in the internet, or like Azure SQL, it will actually be blocking everything from the internet to begin with. But in essence, you do have these firewall rules that you can play with for that service. And so what it means that you are able to allow, for example, certain IP addresses to reach your data service. So for example, if you have a user that is working with SQL Server Management Studio on your Azure SQL, you can allow their IP address in that firewall whitelist. But if you think about this remote time, it is of course possible that you have a lot of users doing that, or their IP addresses are changing, so it can become a lot of management overhead. On the other hand, for your databases, of course, there might be some applications that use that database. And these applications, again, could connect over the internet to this database, and they are then governed by that firewall settings, whether they can reach that public endpoint or not. And now you might be thinking that, well, do I want my application to talk to this database over the internet? It depends. You might not want it to do that. And in case you don't want it to do that, we're going to approach some solutions that you might have to solve this issue. So to set up your database service, whatever it is, whether it's Azure SQL, Cosmos DB, whatever, you in general have two options. Firstly, you have private endpoints. These are also sometimes called private links, but in the documentation, for example, when you go looking for it, private endpoint mostly refers when you're setting this up with an Azure PaaS service. Private link then oftentimes refers to rest of it, other scenarios, and we're going to stick to the private endpoints portion today. The other option you have is service endpoints. And yes, the naming is kind of inconvenient. Private endpoints, service endpoints, it all sounds a bit like the same thing, and we're trying to figure out now what is the difference here. So if we start with the private endpoints, we of course have our database that we want to link into our virtual network. And so you are going to need a virtual network that you have and some subnets that you have put in there and configured. How private endpoints works is that you have actually a network interface that gets created into that subnet that you choose. And in that network interface card, you have a private IP address for this service. And then you create kind of this trust relationship that, hey, this network interface card can talk to this specific resource in Azure SQL or Cosmos DB or Azure Storage or whatever, wherever you have your data resource in. But it is specifically pointing to a single resource, not to like all of Azure SQL, but to a single resource. And there is even an approval process that you go through. If you're working within your subscription only, it happens automatically. But in some cases, you might actually need to go in and accept that approval. If we then look at the service endpoints on the other hand, they work a little differently. again, you have your database and virtual network. But what happens then is that you create this service endpoint into your subnet. And what that means is that you're telling your subnet that, hey, you can talk, for example, to the Azure SQL resources through the Microsoft backbone. You do not have to go through the internet. So pretty much for the subnet, you're only telling like these resources you can go through the backbone. But then in your specific Azure SQL resource, for example, you would go into the settings and say, hey, I will only allow traffic from this specific subnet. So you kind of have a looser relationship here between your resource and this subnet, but you are specifying that it is specifically from this subnet that you can reach our database service, whatever it might be. All right, so you might already kind of hear a little difference here in terms of what these capabilities are doing and how they are connecting to the virtual network. And due to how they are set up, it also means that we have kind of different capabilities that we can reach with them and different scenarios that these are helpful in. So if we first look at the private endpoints portion, we have our virtual network and then we have our database linked in there with the private endpoint. And essentially we have that private IP address that is linked to our Azure database resource. So for example, if we have our application running in another subnet in this virtual network, we are able to reach that database from there. So from any subnet in that same VNet. But also actually, if you have another VNet and your application is running in there, you can set up peering, and then that other application can also reach your database using that same private endpoint. Quite neat. But where this really becomes useful is when you also, for example, have those users that are in your office networks all linked to your company network using VPN. Then these users are also able to reach that database if you have some connectivity to Azure. So for example, you have a VPN set up between your site and Azure, then you are able to reach that database again. So private endpoint really gives you this massive flexibility and really gives you options of from where can you reach that database. If we, on the other hand, look at the service endpoints, my animations are off. We have our database here, and we have our virtual network. And you can see that I already have that application in that subnet where I am creating my service endpoint. And remember, with service endpoint, I'm telling the subnet, hey, you can connect to Azure SQL, for example, from this particular subnet. And on the database side, I'm telling, hey, I will receive traffic from this particular subnet. So you're allowing that. So pretty much you can have an application in the same subnet as your database, and then that application is able to reach that database. But if you put the application in another VNet, subnet in that same VNet, it is no longer able to reach that database because it is looking at, is the traffic coming from this particular subnet? So it is quite a different kind of setup that you're putting in. And there is some ways around how you can kind of fool it that the traffic is coming from the same subnet with load balancers and things, but that is kind of going a bit more in detail. So really, how do you decide between these two options that we have here? How do you decide where you want to go? So you need to figure out what are your scenarios. Do you need to reach the database from on-premises, from other VNets, etc., or are you only trying to restrict the traffic to come from one specific subnet? So figure out your scenarios first and then choose the best possible option that suits your scenario the best. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I hope this opened up these options of securing your database service in your VNet in Azure very well. Do note that there is some kind of difference in what services support each of these capabilities. So that is also one thing you do need to check. But in general, these are the two options that you have to set it up in a good way. So thank you so much for joining, and we are ready to hop onto our little break before the next session.